which is on that version of the program is not quite the right one. He changed his title, so you please give us the right title.
The right title is Minute Meditations on Combustive Transformations, Clues to the Ritual Agency of Fire and its Exegesis.
Okay. Thank you. So, I'll let you go.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come here and talk in this context. I think it's a very interesting topic that was chosen, and I would like to start actually by distributing a text, and it's a translation that I made of a Vedic hymn. And this particular text will serve as my main example. So I would like to go through the text with you after my general presentation. I will try to go through the text and the details of the text with you. And this is a working translation. You should be aware of this, of course. This is preliminary tentative translation. But I first wanted to say something more general. That I was referred to in his talk to Claude Lévi-Strauss, this famous passage in Lévi-Strauss' book on totemism, where Lévi-Strauss quite appropriately distinguished between the nutritional value of animals on the one hand and their cultural exploitation as tools of thought. So there's a passage where he uses this phrase, the famous phrase, animals are good to think or to think with, not only good to eat. And I think that a similar distinction could be made with regard to fire as an agent of nutrition and as an object of symbolic interaction, because in addition to being fed by fuel and facilitating the artificial preparation of food, fire provides excellent food for thought as well. And although this is a familiar matter of fact that needs little empirical backup to prove valid, it seems worthwhile to ponder in what specific regard fire has served this cognitive end. And when I was encouraged to come here today in this multidisciplinary setting to talk about the ritual use of fire, I decided to start from a few very general assumptions and then explore the particular consequences of such assumptions by gradually constraining the subject matter to a limited set of examples, ending up in this particular example, the text that you have in front of you. So my presentation will proceed according to the following logic of progression. First, I will say a few words on the natural properties of fire. This is an area where I'm not an expert, of course, but I thought I should do my best at least to try and understand what fire is, and then I want to talk about the human control of fire. So I've tried to survey the most recent archaeological discourse on these matters, to form an opinion about these things and what archaeologists today think about the human control of fire. Then I wanted to talk on the issue of fire as an object of recognition and signification. And then here it will become very speculative. I'm fully aware of this, so you have to just forgive me if I'm being too speculative, but I think it's allowed in this context. Okay, and then finally I will talk about the significance of ritual and the ritual use of fire, and then spend the rest of the lecture to devote the rest of the lecture to this specific example, this text. And I believe that some of the things that I have said will be illuminated by the text that I have interpreted and translated. So I hope I haven't prepared too much, and if I'm using up too much time, you tell me. I will jump to the text.
No, take your time,
yeah.
Peter, because I suspect the third speaker will not show up.
All right, but I mean, I will. I don't want to spend too much time anyway, because...
Yes, I must explain that I brought him into that. He's a historian, but he's famous for being very distracted and not very involved. But thanks to his hypothetical participation, I got a few $100 from St. Michael College.
Okay.
Because he's supposed to talk about water in Christian rituals. But I had to send him probably a dozen messages before he said, "Oh yes, I will come." So feel free to.
All right.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Well, first, the natural properties of fire. Fire or combustion is a naturally occurring process through which light and heat is released in the form of flames and glowing. Its course has been described in simplistic, so far as I know, simplistic scientific terms as the chemical transformation between fuels and oxidizers, substances that give off oxygen, which causes atoms to regroup and molecules to form new bonds with other molecules. However, a more precise analytical description of combustion was not obtained until quite recently. And the complexity of the process, ranging from the flames of candles and campfires to the thermonuclear heating of stars and the light emitted by exploding supernovas, has required extensive interdisciplinary efforts. Many areas of science are involved in the subject today, such as hydrodynamics, chemical kinetics, thermodynamics, statistical physics, kinetic theory, and quantum theory. But scientific curiosity is certainly not the only reason for this for these in-depth investigation, because the prosperity of a high technological civilization such as ours largely depends on its ability to maintain heat and propagation through engines, explosives, power plants, and so forth, at low levels of economic and ecological expense. Before fire came under the control of humans, of which I will soon come to talk, the association between fire and hominids was largely defined by the detection of stimuli caused by the natural incidence of fire. Lightning, volcanic eruption, sparks from rockfalls, and spontaneous combustion, usually due to microbiological activity in manure and decaying vegetation, so-called peat fires, are the four major natural causes of wildfire ignitions. And furthermore, the human perception of combustion implies a massive impact on the sensory systems. We perceive the light and movements of flame and glow. We feel the heat, hear the crackle and hissing of the burning wood. We smell the dispersed particles of carbon in the air, and may easily deduce the effects of thermal alteration through the taste of cooked meat and by touching its scorched crust. And it's easy to imagine numerous ways in which hominids and early hominins could have benefited from naturally occurring fire long before they gained full control over it. And this is probably how we have to imagine this process. The manipulative control of fire was surely a gradual process, possibly ranging from early ways of abetting natural outbreaks and of storing to refined forms of fire lighting, cooking techniques, and tool manufacturing. But since the details of this long-term process are neither achievable by any existing scientific methods, nor of any great propositional value for my own argumentation, I will confine myself to a few comments on the recent archaeological debate in order to determine the least idiosyncratic consideration of the evidence. So now I turn to the issue of human control and manipulation of fire. Unlike the manufacture of stone tools beginning in the late Pliocene, some 2.5 million years ago, the earliest control of fire can only be assessed by means of indirect inferences. There is no consensus of opinion among archaeologists as to how the traces of natural fire in the archaeological record should be distinguished from those attributed to hominids. Whereas unambiguous evidence of actual earths only start to appear quite late at the end of the Middle Pleistocene, between 300,000 and 250,000 years ago. Numerous archaeological sites in Africa, the Near East and Far East are considered to exhibit strong and much earlier evidence of hominin fire. Even a few lower Pleistocene sites in East Africa, as old as 1.5 million years, have been reported to contain possible evidence, usually in the form of reddened patches or pieces of clay in association with lithics and animal bones. Whatever such a scanty record might contain to exclude the fortuitous effects of natural fire, I think most archaeologists would probably say nothing. It does at least not suggest that Homo erectus, who produced these stone tools in these contexts, was cooking on a regular basis, because analysis of butchering patterns on faunal remains from other lower Pleistocene sites in the same region, especially in the extensively researched Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, did so far not yield any burned bones. So the bones on which these patterns have been found are not burned. And this apparent lack of evidence, that is evidence for a trail of campfires associated with its bones and stone tools, speaks, I think, against the rather famous hypothesis of primatologist Richard Wrangham, who has argued since the late 1990s that cooking and the reduced digestive effort that went with it actually spurred the dramatic anatomical changes seen in Homo erectus, such as expansion of the skull, smaller teeth, smaller jaws and guts. This is what Wrangham describes as pre-digestion. The fact that cooking prepares parts of the digestion process and therefore decreases the effort that it takes to digest food. But I think a similar explanation, more attuned to solid archaeological and not merely anatomical evidence, which has been proposed, would rather be to associate cooking with the rapid expansion, a second phase of rapid expansion of the brain in Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans in the past 500,000 years. So this, I think, is seems to me to be a more convincing explanation. There is a useful, albeit somehow hypercritical, review of the earliest evidence of hominid use of fire, written by Stephen R. James, and he was reluctant to accept even some of the most undoubted evidence from the Middle Pleistocene. And one such case is his critical review of the data from the Sukudian cave system in China, the caves associated with Peking Man, dated to between 400,000 and 500,000 years ago. which is weighed against the possibility of lightning-caused cave fires. I think this looked to me a little hypercritical. I think that the evidence that exists is quite convincing. And in 2004, 1.5 decades after the publication of this critical review, a team of Israeli scholars presented rather striking evidence from the site of Gesher Benot Yaakov in the northern Jordan Valley to suggest the burning of flints, seeds and wood, including olive, wild barley and wild grape in clusters, indicating hearths or hearth-like patterns as old as almost 800,000 years. So the archaeological data, if I may summarize, may thus be delineated according to the following criteria of typology and evidential certainty. First, we have solid evidence of hearths with stones or bones encircling patches of dark brown ash between 250 and 300,000 years old. Then secondly, we have evidence of charred bones, stones, ash and charcoal that may be assigned to hearths that are between 300,000 and 500,000 years old. And thirdly, evidence for burnt flints, seeds and wood found in earth-like patterns that are almost 800,000 years ago. So it's fairly certain that fire was controlled and used 800,000 years ago, but we don't know exactly for what purpose. It's not necessary to assume that those early humans or hominins were cooking. They might have used fire for other purposes. But to these assemblages, we could also add a more recent South African case of pyrotechnology as a means of increasing the quality of the stone tool manufacturing process, the so-called flaking benefits. It is a technological advancement that deserves particular mentioning in this connection because it roughly coincides with the earliest indications of symbolicity among anatomically modern humans, especially the perforate. I'm thinking especially of the perforated beads and engraved pieces of ochre, some of which are as old as 80,000 years, found in the South African Blombos cave, a very important artifacts suggesting early symbolic behavior among anatomically modern humans. The physical evidence of such capacities mark the archaeological gateway to that blurred and largely impenetrable space of behavioral modernity, in which secondary meanings, what the Germans would call Sinnbedeutungen, transcend the primary purpose of things, their Zweckbedeutung. While the further exploitation of fire has remained a technological challenge on purely pragmatic grounds, it was probably already in an early stage of its domestication that fire required such a secondary status. It is to such fleeting matters, to fire as signifier, that I now want to turn my attention. So now I'm going to talk about the signification and recognition of fire. The American physicist John Archibald Wheeler assumed in a quite visionary text, a scientific report, and as a prelude to his famous dictum, "It from bit," that I'm quoting, every physical quantity, every it, derives its ultimate significance from bits, more precisely from the elementary act of observer participancy, through which information gives rise to physics. I shall not pretend to have grasped all the subtleties of Wheeler's visionary report. Suffice it to say that the age-old idea of deriving existence from the act of recognition still seems to inform, at least partly, the very foundations of scientific thought. These are areas where physicists where disciplines such as physics, a discipline such as physics cannot really do without a dialogue with other disciplines such as philosophy and perhaps even history. If existence, that is, the sum total of its, depends on the exchange of bits through observer participancy, the contiguity of recognition and significance and signification cannot be recognized as such. It cannot become apparent to itself without an analogical intermediary in what is already physically recognized. And fire elicits some of those physical quantities, heat, luminous flux, energy, and so forth, some of those recognized its that can be amplified and reconverted into bits of information so as to make the conscious establishment of meaning recognizable to itself. While this proposition may seem a little bit far-fetched, it requires further consideration and historical grounding before we can start appreciating its outcome as ritual exegesis. It is by paying attention to such features of ritual thought that we may hope to advance, if only by a fraction, the understanding of ritual both as a mode and an object of human theorizing. Now, combustion is not just any object of ritual thought and action. As I already mentioned, the very process of thinking, to some extent even the ritual process as a whole, can be perceived analogically as forms of burning, heating and cooking. And this has been observed by many scholars, but it has also been observed at an early stage, long before the development of modern scientific discourse. And nothing seems better apt to increase the self-awareness of a speculating ritual subject than the workings of combustion. This is a process through which the physical properties of space and matter are transformed into something manageable, translucent, and digestible. The analogy goes so far as to allow the explanatory properties of analogy itself to become highlighted by analogy with combustion. When the properties of one thing are mentally transformed into those of another, a partial similarity in the appearance of mental objects results from the same fiery fix, from the same unemployment of the hand in favor of automation. And just as fire adds no weight to the air in which it burns, thoughts are weightless transformers of mental matters, weightless transmitters of mental matter. And such circuits of analogical reasoning may feed back into the utilitarian employment of fire to inform the kind of costly, pretentious, and often highly routinized forms of behavior known as rituals. So, what then is a ritual? This is of course a big question, and now I'm just giving you one version, I will try to say some words about ritual, how I think that ritual can and should be understood. And what I'm going to say is partly based on the works of two historians of religions. One is now in Chicago, Jonathan Z. Smith, who wrote an important paper called The Domestication of Sacrifice. It's a paper on sacrifice which was partly written as a critique of contemporary theories of sacrifice that wanted to trace sacrifice to early stages of human history, and this is Jonathan Z. Smith's attempt to show that sacrifice is founded on the process of domestication. And I'm also going to base part of what I'm going to say on a couple of articles, important articles written by the historian of religions, Gustavo Benavides. So all these things are not only my own based on my own ideas. I believe that the question of ritual, what ritual is, what it does, and why it is, can only be properly appreciated with reference to the question of domestication. That is, to the acts of seizure through which humans have subjected themselves, and the forces of nature, unrestrained forces of nature, to careful management. In this context of domestication and economy, these words, domestication and economy, are virtually synonymous. However, rituals cannot simply constitute failures to domesticate and economize, since they are usually not very economical and rarely achieve any pronounced ambitions to seize unrestrained forces. It would seem ill-advised to maintain them. And I would rather argue as follows: if culture at large suggests the transformation of an involuntary necessity into a state of being fixed, into a state of being prepared, ritual is the quintessential second-order expression of that transformation. It is the process through which the process of domestication of culture as a whole, if you will, becomes apparent to itself. By drawing on Wittgenstein's perceptive critique of Fraser's The Golden Bough, I strongly object to the notion that was maintained by Fraser, that ritual practice ensues from a misinformed theory of how to control the natural world. The classical example of this would be rain making, and suggesting that people were simply stupid in the past and thought that they could, by doing something, for instance, splashing water on the ground, they could create rain. The fact that this is done does not necessarily imply that this act is based on a theory, a misinformed theory of how nature works, which was basically what Fraser suggested. To the extent that rites cause overt and lasting changes in the world, these will rather occur, and are mostly only expected to occur, in an already domesticated sphere of social institutions. For instance, through divinatory decision-making, the transformation of someone's social status, the conclusion of a treaty, capital punishment, etc. Rituals do not so much ensue from theorizing as they become means of theorizing. Ritual theory is always already a part of the ritual process, not its incentive. The most obvious example would be early Greek philosophy and the autotelic scientific endeavors that developed in its wake, for it was largely by extending and inculating certain modes of ritual through the practice of asceticism and self-care, what is called epimeleia heautou in classical Greek, a concept that appears in Plato, for instance, that the first philosophers maintained the pursuit of universal knowledge. So the early philosophers, which were really organized in what we would today call a sect, practiced a form of could be seen as maintaining a permanent state of ritual purity and self-discipline. That is something that was something that rather appeared on specific occasions in the public ritual sphere. So what the early philosophers did was extending this state of purity and discipline to involve the whole life. Another and closely related notion of ritual, I think, deserves critical attention in this connection. It suggests that rites are essentially forms of deception. The classical example would be Plato's parable of the cave. starting to interact with fire. But I think that what I want to say is that it has an immense effect on the sensory systems. And it must have, for that reason, been a quite important phenomenon on the stage.
Also, fascination for fire. Fascination for fire is very important. I used to know, when I was a student, a German student who had been in jail several times because he loved to set forest on fire, simply because for him it was the greatest. I don't know if it was erotic or aesthetic, but when he was speaking of fire, he was really illuminated. He was incredibly, transformed. And I must say that Tom Lisowski, who is here recording, has a little company which is called Pyrocom. As you know, pyro is a Greek word for fire. Thank you. You will pour water on that. So this is Professor Giulio Silano from St. Michael, who will talk about water, and this is Peter Jackson, who is talking about fire. And we had also something about fire this morning with the drivers Georgiou. So we missed you, but we were happy that you showed up.
Good, you can continue.
Shall I go on?
Yep.
Pyrocom give you license
To talk.
So before we stop, I was talking about an idea about ritual practice that I strongly object to, namely the idea that rituals are based on misinformed theories of how the natural world works. This I don't think, this is not a convincing theory. It was the theory of Fraser, but it has been, I think there are good reasons to object to that. Then I came to this other point, another and closely related notion of ritual, namely that it has to do with deception. That it was used and is used as an instrument of deception, and it's obvious that rituals are and have been used in contexts of social and political authority, but it seems inaccurate to assume that rites are simply means of contrivance, because people engage, it seems to me, in such games of pretense by acting as if, by obeying complex forms of as-ifness. For instance, a ruler, a king involved in make-believe labor. You think about Mussolini, who in the 20s he was photographed while using a spade or a shovel. The leader takes part in labor, but everybody knows that this is not what he actually does. This would be one example. Priests communicating with gods, charades and masquerades, statues addressed as volitional agents, even articles of faith. Even articles of faith can be approached in this manner. It's so to say, obeying to the idea of belief, and not because it's not necessarily because you have been fooled into believing, or by being convinced by others in doing so, but because of the many secondary advantages that come with this, emotional advantages, social, economic, that such participatory responses might entail. As if scenarios may suddenly engender advanced forms of metacognition. For instance, what it means, it could lead to a reflection upon the question as what it means to be a god on the conditions that gods exist, what a ritual agent essentially intends, and how this intention originated. For instance, but this does not imply that such scenarios were originally designed as deceptive contrivers of veracity, or that these theories about a god, or what a god might be, or what a ritual does, are the reasons for the rituals themselves. Now, if all this holds true, it should also mean that the method of the famous method of epoche, which was originally a rhetorical term, the suspension of judgment that anthropologists have been using in situations of observer participancy, was never just an outsider's means, the anthropologist's means of gaining access to the complexities of ritual, but I believe also the desirable mindset of the insider, of the ritual participant, because playing by the rules also involves playing well and convincingly. So I think epoche should not only be seen as the methods that a researcher is using to gain access to religion, but it's also used in religious situations all the time. Before I can turn to the discrete textual datum serving as my major example, I need to touch upon a final aspect of ritual that brings me back to the theme of domesticated fire, and that is ritual's strong bearing on cooking and eating. One of the most widespread and familiar genres of ritual, rites of hospitality, are usually seen to revolve around the preparation and consumption of food. And furthermore, what is done in most rituals involving food and drink, that is cooking and eating, informs the understanding of what the ritual does to its participants, that is preparing and consuming them, transforming them and purifying them. This line of thought is captured by the Sanskrit concept lokapakti, which appears in Vedic prose, meaning cooking the world, which expresses the reciprocal sense of cooking and being cooked through the execution of ritual. This is a concept that was discussed by the French Indologist Charles Malamud in a book with the same title, Cooking, in English translation, Cooking the World, Cuire le Monde. So he discusses this concept in a very interesting way. The developed sense of the cognate Latin verb coquo, the verb coquo is related to the Sanskrit verbal root pach, meaning to cook, as in loka pakti, and goes derives from an Indo-European verbal stem, pek, to cook, to ripen. But coquo, in Latin cook, could also mean to elaborate something in mind, to ponder, to meditate upon something. Hence the title of my paper. I think the same goes for French. Yeah, cuire could be used in this sense as well, to reflect upon something, at least what I found when I looked the verb up in a dictionary. But
Yes, possibly.
But the notion of heating, the notion of heating ingredients over fire has formed the basis of any kind of transformation, whether it is mental, symbolic, or purely physical. Cooking and eating, furthermore, creates it's something that is highly relevant to understanding what happens when a host eats with his or her guest, because what happens then is that the latter, namely the guest, turns into a temporary family member. So cooking and eating creates symbolic consanguinity. But there is also, so you could if you like, you could even say that by cooking and eating with a guest, the guest is cooked, is turned into something else, is integrated. He becomes an in-group member of the group, whereas he was something else beforehand. But there is also a third, often in situations like these, a third imaginary party involved in the process, especially when we are dealing with ritual enactments of hospitality, and that's the kind of imaginary party that we will discuss soon by looking at this text, namely the God, the ontological other. The act of cooking with and cooking the outgroup other correlates to a certain extent with the notion of the ritually conjured ontological other that takes part in this process. So we have the host on the one hand, the guest on the other hand, and the ontological other that becomes a part of this process, forming a ritual. Now, so these are things that I've been talking about in order to give you kind of background before we turn to the text which I now wanted to discuss with you, the text that I have distributed. Very shortly, I should say that this. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this kind of literature, which is referred to as Vedic literature, and this is a text from the oldest collection of hymns known as the Rig Veda. These hymns are usually thought to have been composed from the mid-second millennium before Common Era to the end of the second millennium. So there's a time span of almost 500 years at least in which they were composed. They were not composed or transmitted by the use of writing. So although what you have in front of you is a written text, writing was not the medium used for transmitting and composing these hymns. It was an oral tradition, and it's still practiced in India today. The way of remembering these hymns, transmitting them from father to son, from teacher to pupil, are based on very rigid patterns, and there are virtually no examples in Vedic literature of something that we find very often in other literatures that is different textual variants and variations, because the texts have been very much transmitted in the same fashion. By paying attention to this, to all aspects, all details of the hymn, from each singular accent, they have been preserved very accurately. I should also say that this particular hymn, which is addressed to the god Agni, the god of fire, which both denotes the fire as a physical phenomenon, but also the god Agni, the god of fire. And fire was a very important ingredient of Vedic ritual. The ritual ground had several fires burning on it, and there was also a central altar, a fire altar on the ritual ground. The hymn, the Rig Veda, consists of 10 so-called cycles or mandalas, collections of hymns, and the oldest stratum, the oldest part of the collection, are the so-called family books. We should perhaps not use the term books because they were not written, but collections of hymns that were preserved within priestly families. This hymn comes from the 7th mandala, which is attributed to a specific lineage of poets known as the Vasishtas. But Vasishta is a poet which it's hard to grasp him. It's hard to to say anything certain about his historicity, but he seems to have been associated with it seems to have worked as a kind of court poet in a time when there was a conflict between several Vedic tribes, and there are references to a famous battle in this literature, the Battle of the 10 Kings, the event that might be reflected in the famous Indic epic, the Mahabharata. And the king who was victorious in this battle was Sudha. He belonged to the tribe of the Bharatas, and he had Vasishta, the legendary poet, as one of his court poets. So the hymns in this collection are all attributed to Vasishta himself or to poets that belonged to the family. And I should also say that while the highly specialized poetic terminology of the 6 stanzas must remain surmised, their relative intelligibility and familiarity are improved by 2 fortunate circumstances. First, the hymn is enmeshed in a comprehensive intertextual network of erratic poetry from the same period, the large collection that I was just referring to, where we have lots of parallels to the things that we find in this hymn. And secondly, offshoots of the hereditary vocabulary in cognate Indo-European languages, including modern English, provide diachronic gateways to its long-lost past. References to classical Greek and Latin come particularly handy in this regard because, as you know, the classical languages still inform the conceptual matrix of modern scholarly parlance. Examples of English vocables with cognates in the present hymn are the verbative nouns caveat and hypostasis. Hypostasis, how do you pronounce it in English? Hypostasis. Yeah?
Hypostasis.
Hypostasis. And the combination forms U as in U. Hypostasis. Yeah. The combination forms U as in eupeptic, and crazy, not crazy, but crazy as in democracy, and the indigenous suffix hood as in neighborhood. These are all examples of vocables that have cognates in the present hymn, which I will explain soon. And so I will try to guide you through the hymn verse by verse, and I will try to elucidate the details insofar as it's possible and necessary. So let's just. So I should also mention that I'm sometimes using a quite archaic English, using thou and thy and ye and so on, because it's not. If I hadn't done it, it wouldn't be apparent who is referred to here in the hymn. So it's made things easier for me somehow. So let's start. The first verse I've translated as follows: the suitor of the dawns, the Ushashas, has awakened or arisen from their womb. The word being used here, which I translate as womb, upasta, actually as literally means that which stands under or below. So it's the same, etymologically the same word as substance or hypostasis, right? But it's usually translated as womb in the transferred sense. So Agni is the suitor of the dawns, and he has awakened or arisen from their womb. The excited priest, the purified supreme seer, he establishes the distinguishing mark of the two-sided tribe, probably gods and men, bringing libations onto the gods and movable wealth onto the benefactors. So now I will try to explain some of the details here. First of all, Agni is described as being excited, as mandra, and the adjective is related to a verb meaning to intoxicate, mud, to intoxicate oneself. And it probably is, it should probably be explained through the fact that Agni is being fed with libations, for instance, including the uncooked juice of the soma plant. Soma was a plant that is it's not known to us today what plant this was, but it was most likely a plant that produced a state of excitement and hallucinogenic of sorts, and it was pressed, and the juice was bitter, had a bitter taste. We can be sure about that, but much more than that we don't know. So this might make sense if Agni is referred to as being excited by being intoxicated through the fact that this intoxicating juice is poured into the fire, and also in certain cases drunk by the ritual participants. And he is described as Hota, whereas Hota designates the priest, the sacrificial agent, the ritual agent who pours libation, the libator. Kavi, the other word used here, he's the supreme seer, the supreme seer, Kavi Tamas. So he's also Kavi. This word refers to another kind of ritual specialist, especially with an emphasis on his capacity to foresee and being perceptive. So what's interesting here is that Agni is, on the other hand, is the god who receives the libations, but because he is the god who also brings the libations to the gods, he is also conceived of as a ritual, in terms of a ritual specialist. So he has both roles in this scenario. And the interesting word Ketu, which you find in this verse, he is what I translate with distinguishing mark. He establishes the distinguishing mark of the two-sided tribe. Here, Ketu denotes most likely something that is a distinguishing mark, a visually determined mark. Sometimes it can refer to a banner as well, but it also has this abstract sense. Agni is also in other Vedic hymns described as the mark of ritual, as Yajñasya Ketu, as the mark of ritual. So the semiotic sense of Ketu, this term, survives in a cognate Germanic suffix realized as German height, and English hood, to denote a condition or quality. So by bilaterally establishing the hood of the hood, as it were, Agni installs sacrifice as a means of regulating the sacrificial economy of gods and men. So the two-sided tribe probably refers to God and man, and Agni is the god who creates an interface between these two groups. Agni's multimodality is further emphasized by the poet, who imagines the god as the mutual subject, hotar, and object, mandra, of libations. I was already referring to this notion. While the latter notion, Agni as an object of libations, is only implicit in this stanza, there are other Vedic hymns in which it is really made explicit. Agni is referred to as Ahutam Gritai, which means besprinkled with clarified butter. That is something that often often is used as an element of libation. So he is the one who receives or is besprinkled by this substance. And this is interesting because the notion of divinity as the quintessential object of libations survived in the neutral Germanic noun Gud, Guto in Indo-European, which eventually produced the secondary masculine form God. So the the English word God originally meant that which that which receives libations. Yeah. Okay. So next verse. He, the well-tempered one, who covers apart the doors of the panis, purifies for us the much enjoyable splendor or song. The excited priest, lord of the household, has gazed through the darkness of the night. Now first, Agni is called Sukratu. I translate this as well-tempered because there is an exact parallel in the Greek adjective evkratos, meaning exactly this, well-tempered or tempered. There's a reference to the doors of the panis, and this is completely incomprehensible as it stands, but there are lots of references to the panis in other Vedic hymns, allowing us to reconstruct a mythic scenario from this phrase. This is what we could refer to as an encapsulation of an elaborate mythic scenario with deep Indo-Iranian roots. So we also find references to this myth in early Iranian literature. What happens in this myth is that the panis are demons, demonic beings living far away from Vedic, at the outskirts of society, and they have stolen cattle and locked it inside a rock. And the god Agni, sometimes also, in many cases also Indra and other groups of mythical beings, release the cattle from the cave, from the rock. They sing the cattle out of the rock, which is also something that is a motive that is also associated with the appearance of dawn. So in a way, ritual is in this myth. Ritual creates the precondition. It's a myth describing the first ritual, which creates wealth. Ritual creating wealth in the form of cattle. And it's also important that the panis could in some cases refer to someone who is greedy. So it seems as if the myth refers also to indirectly to a greedy patron, namely the person who pays for the ritual service, who is supposed to pay the priest the performance of the ritual in the form of cattle, and this is what the priests are expecting, and also something that is reflected in the poetry. And here in this myth, the panis are represented in a way that a ritual patron does not want to be represented, namely as being greedy.
Peter, 1 minute. We started 15 minutes late, so we continue and you will be in 15 minutes. So
that's okay. And in this, in the second stanza, the song may be considered much enjoyable. I've translated this word puro bojasa, and it could be understood from diametrically opposed angles as much enjoyable. One, because it's enjoyable to listen to, but secondly, because it hopefully, from the point of view of the poet, he is presented as the host, as the lord of the house, the one who receives guests. And this is interesting because we will see in a following passage that he could also be described as the guest. So there is an important aspect of reciprocity involved in this. You could also notice that the conflation of light and vision is notable, appears here with regard to fire and the verb drish that is used. Fire was in this strophe. Fire was apparently imagined both as gazing, as a gazing subject, someone who sees, and as an object of flashing, something flashing from the eyes, the gazing eyes. And this is seen, for instance, in Greek. In the Odyssey, there is a passage that I noticed, Pyr of Talmoisi de Dorpos, which means flashing fire from his eyes. So the god's drish, the god's sight, was conceived in the double sense of a gazing and illuminating force. And then we come to the third verse. The sharp-witted seer is Aditi. Agni is identified with Aditi. Is Vivasvat, is Mitra of good company, is our amiable guest. He shines as the clear light at the peak of the dunes. As the offspring of waters, he has entered into the fertile ones, into the plants. Now, we pass from the passage in the previous stanza where illumination and sight was referred to perception and insight, which is reflected here, and because Agni is referred to as being the kavi that is unfoolish, amura meaning unfoolish. So his kavi, once again, kavi, this title of a ritual agent that is not foolish, and this privative noun is exclusively used to denote gods as opposed to humans being sluggish, muras. Aditi here refers to a goddess. It means the unconstrained, the unchained one, probably in an ethical sense. She's the mother of a group of gods, collectively referred to as the Adityas, involving gods such as Varuna, Mitra, and Aryaman. And Vivasvat is a mythical being associated with the dawn and with Yama, the first mortal to press Soma. So Vivasvat is a being that sometimes acts as a human being and sometimes is referred to as a god, as a divine being, so is a semi-god of sorts. The god Mitra is linked to the notion of contract. Could also, the word could also mean contract. It could also mean friend, and this means that so is a god, a personification of an abstract notion, and this means that Mitra, the appearance of Mitra in this particular strophe, prefigures the subsequent notion of divine hospitality. The reciprocal notion of Agni as a guest evokes the triangular relationship between poet-priests, if you will, the patron who finances the ritual, and the god. There is a whole a large group of dithematic personal names, not only in Vedic but also in Iranian languages and in Greek, Slavic and Germanic, such as, for instance, Mitratihti, meaning either having Mitra as guest in the determinative sense, or in the positive sense, Mitra's guest, which is the name, a typical name of a chief, who finances rituals. So this is the kind of name that defines the aristocratic patron in his function as the good host of gods and poet priests, who anticipates a future existence in the company of the gods. And the guest, Agni as guest, is characterized through the adjective amiable, Shiva. Of course, you recognize the epithet Shiva. So in classical Hinduism, it becomes the name of a specific god, but it was in Vedic used among as an epithet of, among other, Rudra, and it's this is the probably the god with which we should identify Shiva in classical Hinduism. And it's also interesting to note that the last section of this stanza gives an example of early forms of natural philosophy. I'm referring to this passage. As the offspring of the waters, he has entered into the fertile ones. What's at stake here? As I see it, Agni is looked upon as the potency of the water passing into. He has entered into the fertile ones, the plants, causing them to grow and eventually turn into flammable matter. So behind this lies probably a circular transformation of fire into water, into plants, into fire, which is deduced from the apparent fact that fire is immersed in rather than put out by water. So when you put out fire using water, fire does not disappear but enters into the water, and that explains why it is distinguished. And then water propagates growth, which can be observed, of course, and fire is then derived from dry plants. So there is a circularity here. Okay, the next stanza. O Agni, convey thy message, bring thy message, do not get hurt. While doing so, by means of the conjuring community, the ritual community, you shall honor Sarasvati, the Maruts, the Ashvins, the waters, all the gods, for the sake of obtaining riches. This is the first verse in which the god is addressed by his proper name, Agni. The Brahman, I'm referring to the compound Brahmakrita, those who perform, make the Brahman, denotes the ritual formulation with special regard to its transformative capacity, meaning something like formulation. Agni once again serves as the sacrificial subject. He is encouraged by the sacrificial community to sacrifice on their behalf. So he's supposed to bring and convey the message. And then we come to the final verse. When Vasishta ignited thee, O Agni, he killed Jaruta. You shall honor Purandi for the sake of wealth. Sing the choral hymn, sorry for the misspelling here. O Jatavedas, protect ye gods, that is, as always, with blessings. The first part of this verse refers to a event that is hard to grasp. This passage suggests that Vasishta is killing or was killing someone known as Jaruta, but in other hymns this event is ascribed to Agni himself. So it's a little hard to know what's going on here. There's an ambiguity as to the killing of who is the killing subject here. Purandi is a goddess of victory and wealth, and she is possibly invoked here as a sign of gratitude for a previous victory. And the very final part of the final strophe, sing the choral hymns, or rather protect your gods as always with blessing, occurs elsewhere in this particular collection, in this particular mandala, and it has been regarded as a sort of signature used by the Vasishtas. So it's not something that can be seen in the context of this particular, or should be seen in the context of this particular hymn. So I come now to my, I should conclude here, because I've been using up much of my time now. What I wanted to say, just as a final comment, is that it's quite obvious that when we look at a singular text as this one, an early hymn used in a ritual context, composed for the purpose of being performed in the ritual context, and also considering the fact that these hymns were once new, they were once performed for the first time, and in many of the hymns that appear in this collection, this is explicitly said. So what happens at a certain stage is that this collection is crystallized into a fixed corpus of texts. But in the time when these hymns were first composed, they were not supposed to be repeated again. So there was there was certainly an ambition among these poets to be creative, to be to simply not copy what other poets composed before them, but still maintain a sense of a respect for certain traditions as to how this poetry should be composed and what it should contain. And this means that the meaning that is conveyed by this hymn does not reflect the meaning of the ritual. I think it's inaccurate to talk about a inherent meaning of ritual. Meaning is created in ritual by the ritual participants, and it's part of a creative process that we can grasp partly, at least, by looking at this particular example. And the creative analysis of ritual was never just the job of modern scholarship. It was already taking place in the earliest ritual texts that we have. Fire in this hymn is presented as a transformative ritual agent. Agni is constantly shifting roles, as if the poet wanted to tell us that he embodies the very syntax and significance of ritual, because he enters into the roles of the priest. He is the object of the ritual. He is the abstract. He constitutes the foundation of ritual in an abstract sense as well. He assumes the reciprocal roles of a priestly subject and a divine object of worship. He is the good host, Damunas. He is the guest, the god as guest, but then of course with a reference to the outgroup member that is invited into the household. He is the message and the messenger, so to say, in his capacity as sign. If I'm now, I should perhaps have been talking more about signs more explicitly, because this is a conference on semiotics. But in his capacity as sign, as mark, as ketu, he is not only the ritual, if you will, the ritual engine burning in the midst of the sacrificial ground, but also the temporal marker of a proper ritual beginning, because he is associated with dawn. He appears at dawn. He is and dawn in Vedic society was the preferable time of ritual performances. So many of the important rituals, such as the first soma pressing and other important rituals, began at or were performed at dawn. Dawn is also the moment when poetry is composed and inspiration comes to the poet. So in that sense, Agni appears at dawn and becomes the sign of ritual and a ritual beginning. So I would like to end here just mentioning I started by referring to Levi-Strauss, the famous passage in which he talks about animals being good to think. He is also in another paper emphasized the fact that man has always been thinking equally well. I think this is a very important point he makes, that comparing, for instance, a stone axe with a metal axe, what differentiates the two axes is not that the first axe is worsely made, but they are simply made in different materials. The stone axe is just as well made. So what differentiates the way humans think is the context of thinking and what we think with. So I think that this, by looking at details of a hymn like this, an early example of ritual speculation, I think this becomes quite apparent. We have always been thinking equally well.
Thank you. I think we should move. We will certainly come back to that because there will be questions. There is still coffee available if someone wants to get a coffee. And then we shall move to a talk by our colleague from St. Michael College and the Department of History, I believe. Yeah. Giulio Silano, who, yes, we'll go get some coffee first. Yes.